Pretty good job last night. Okay, we're going to turn to our text. We had these 2 Sundays stuck here between the end of the sermon series last week and Thanksgiving, and I was kind of thinking about what to do with them, and I'm going to talk about Thanksgiving some next week, but I thought today that we'd talk a little bit about the church, just about the church, and we're going to turn to this text in Matthew, the 16th chapter, right in the middle of Matthew. It's a very, very important text, and you can preach this in lots of different ways, but it is an important text about our understanding of the church, so we're going to kind of drill down on that today. When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" And they replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." "But what about you?" he asked. "Who do you say I am?" And Simon Peter answered, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus replied, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by man, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock," I love this phrase, "on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not overcome it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. And whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." Then he warned the disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Christ. And from that time on, Jesus began to teach them that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and on the 3rd day be raised to life. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. "Never, Lord," he said, "this shall never happen to you." And Jesus turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the things of God, but the things of men." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. This last week I had lunch with one of the bright young stars in the North Texas Conference, a young clergy woman, brilliant. She's doing a great job. She called me. She said, "Can we have lunch?" They got big plans at her church, and she wanted to talk some of that through, and we did. We spent probably an hour, maybe an hour and 15 or 20 minutes talking just about her church. And then as we came to the end of the lunch, she got very serious, and she looked me right in the eye, and she said, "Now here, this is the $64,000 question for you. You've been around Methodism about as much as anybody I know, and I want to know the answer. Is the church dying?" And I thought about that before I answered. I knew how important the question was for her. On the one hand, it was a generic question. She wants to know whether the church is dying. But on the other hand, it's a very personal question as well. She's 47 years old. She's got 20 years to serve in this church, and she wanted to know, am I going to be serving in a living church or in a dying church? It was an extraordinarily personal question. And I looked her right back in the eyes, and I gave her the answer that she did not want to hear. I said, "The church is dying." Yes, the church is dying. And then I rattled off all those things that we've been talking about for the last several years around here. This new Pew survey research, we've already talked about it several times. Now, less than half of Americans profess to be a part of a Protestant congregation. First time in the history of America. These enormous secular trends, the headwinds that are against us. The truth of the matter is that America is starting to look more and more like Europe, where Christianity in general just seems to be irrelevant, where the world is becoming more and more secular. So the church, it doesn't make any difference whether you're talking about the Methodist church or the Pentecostal church or the Baptist church. The church is sailing against these enormous headwinds these days. And then I talked about the Methodist church. We have brilliant leaders still in the Methodist church, and yet we have an archaic structure. We have a rule-bound mentality where it seems to be almost impossible to make relevant changes in the Methodist structure that will help us be more relevant to the society in which we are living. And I looked at her and I said, "Yes, the church is dying." And then I said, "And this is the most exciting time to be in ministry in my 40 years. Never has it been more exciting, more challenging, more fun, or more important to be in ministry right now." Because where the church is dying, the church is also rising. The church is rising in important and powerful ways. And I am absolutely convinced that the church is more important than ever before. And that you and I have the remarkable privilege of being a part of a church that is rising. When we look at this text this morning, I'm going to go to the text. When we look at this text this morning, what we discover is that it is a text that tells us a lot about the church. When you read the New Testament, you will discover that the church is, for the most part, a post-resurrection, post-New Testament phenomenon. There's not a lot said in the New Testament about the church, except for primarily in the book of Acts. But this passage tells us a great deal about what it was that Jesus expected out of the church. And two lines especially that I just think are remarkable. He turns to Peter when he says, Peter, you are the rock, and on this church I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. And he gives to Peter the keys to the kingdom. These are some of the greatest words of praise that you ever find coming out of the lips of Jesus. And yet in the next paragraph, only a few minutes later, we can only assume in this discussion, Peter gets it wrong. And you find some of the harshest words coming out of the lips of Jesus. Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. You are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things. When you look at this text and you ask yourself, what does it mean in terms of what the church is supposed to be? You say that it is telling us that the church, that there are two things that are essential for the rising church. One is clarity about the mission that Jesus gave us. And secondly, passion on the behalf of the believers in building the kingdom of God. Peter had one, he didn't have the other. Peter, when Jesus starts talking about what it means to be the church, what he himself will have to do, the mission, going to Jerusalem, suffering and dying, Peter says, no, we don't have to do any of that. We can just have an easy church. We can have an easy mission. We can have one where we really don't have to suffer. He got it wrong. And we find these harsh words from Jesus, get thee behind me, Satan. And we understand that that was a continuing issue in this relationship between Jesus and Peter. On the one hand, Jesus gave to Peter the keys of the kingdom. He did it because of Peter's passion. We'll talk about that in a moment. But on the other hand, he always worried about the tendency of Peter to lose sight or to lose clarity about the mission. You remember the story after the resurrection? It's in the Gospel of John. Jesus has been resurrected, and Peter and the other disciples have gone out fishing. They're in a boat out fishing on the Sea of Galilee or someplace. And Peter, the resurrected Christ, shows up on the beach. And Peter is so excited. He strips down off his clothes. He jumps into the ocean and he swims to the beach. He's the first to get there because he's so excited to see Jesus. But there is this testy moment between the two of them. Jesus is circled back around because he wants to make sure that Peter understands the mission. And he says to him, Peter, do you love me? And Peter says, well, Lord, you know I love you. Then he says, feed my sheep. Love God, serve neighbor. He says it again. Peter, do you love me? He says, of course I love you. Then feed my sheep. And he asks him a third time because he wants to make sure that Peter will never, ever again lose focus or clarity about the mission. Do you love me? Then feed my sheep. And when Jesus uses the word sheep, we know who he was talking about. He wasn't talking about the Gentiles. He wasn't talking about the Christians. He wasn't talking about the Jews. He was talking about all of them. Feed my sheep. Wherever you find my people, wherever you find the people of God, feed them. Jesus understood that clarity about the mission would be essential for the church. It's easy, I think, to lose clarity about the mission of the church. Trey West sent this to me this past week. Claire, of course, sent it to me as well. You may have seen this. This is an article in, it's online. It's written by a guy named Richard Stearns, who's the president of the World Vision. And he talks about some of the things we've talked about. He says, a lot of us are concerned about the dying church, and so we have been all focused on those outward symbols of the dying church. The 10 Commandments coming out of the courthouse, all those things. He says, maybe we've been worried about the wrong thing. He says, when we are clear about the mission of the church, and we just said about that, then the church is rising. And I absolutely believe that. Whenever I talk about, I'm going to read some of this, I'll post this. Whenever I read something like this, people say, well, I want a copy of it. I'm going to post this, the link to this, on my blog. And the address to the blog is in the bulletin, so you can find it. This is what our communication people call driving traffic to the blog. So, but I encourage you to read this. It's important and powerful. He tells a story about a church in Tacoma, Washington, which I did not know of, called Life Center Church in Tacoma, Washington. It's an evangelical church. It was concerned about all those things. They were known for their Christmas pageant, number one, and number two, fighting about all these political things, the 10 Commandments and all of these kind of political, social things that people are concerned about. And he said the pastor ran into somebody one day, and they said, oh, yeah, I know who you are. You're the church with the big Christmas pageant. Like many other churches, Life Center was also known for what it was opposed to. Now I'm going to read. But that began to change after the pastor made a trip to Lesotho, a small country in southern Africa, in 2005. His name is Dean Curry. He had an encounter with suffering and an encounter with God. After witnessing the ravages of AIDS and the plight of orphans he had met one day, Dean lay in a bed in a grass-roofed hut, weeping. He was overwhelmed by a problem that was so much bigger than anything his church could address. This is too big for our church, he said to himself. We can't just add this to our mission budget. How can I do this? He goes on to say, Dean believes that God gave him an answer that night. You need to mobilize your entire city to care for these orphans. The group returned to Tacoma with broken hearts, but with the determination to come together as a city to help this tiny country of Lesotho, 10,000 miles away. The Global Neighbor Project was born. Today, now 7 years later, more than 5,000 people have become involved in one way or another. The mayor, the public schools, Rotary clubs, other churches, small businesses, judges, the head of the Humane Society, the Jewish community, and some of the local policemen. They are all transforming lives half a world away. Pastor Curry said this, we also engaged folks from the gay community. These were people who wouldn't have returned my call as an evangelical leader, but now they want to partner with our church. They achieved in 5 years what they expected would take 15 years. HIV/AIDS orphans receive help. Those who are HIV positive receive care so that their children will not become orphans. In the 7 years since the Global Neighbor Project began, Life Center has seen its membership double. The church rising. Pastor Curry said, we used to be known as that church with the big Christmas pageant. Now we're known as the church that is helping orphans. When we have clarity about the mission that Jesus gave us, the church is not dying. The church is rising. There are some people who wouldn't be comfortable with a church like that. I know that because I got a letter not too long ago from somebody that was unhappy about the fact that we invited Muslims to partner with us one Saturday on House on the Corner. It's real interesting. You talk to the people who are working on the house, and we've done this 2 years in a row. You talk to people working on the House on the Corner, they will tell you, and they're of all political persuasions, some just as conservative as you can possibly get. They'll tell you it was one of the most powerful spiritual experiences they'd ever had. Praying together and hammering nails together with people that they didn't understand. There are some people who wouldn't be comfortable with that kind of a church, but I know one person who would be. That would be Jesus. That would be Jesus. When we have clarity about this issue, about loving God, loving others, transforming lives, feeding sheep. The church rises in those places where it was dead. But let me be clear about this. This text tells us that there are two things that are necessary for the church to rise. One is clarity about the mission which Jesus gives us, and we don't have to worry about that because Jesus gives it to us. But the other is passion on the part of the believers. And that's the part we have to worry about. The reason I know this is because Peter was the one that Jesus chose to be head of the church. He says, "You are the rock, and upon this rock I will build my church." If you look at the career of Jesus, of Peter, as we see it in the New Testament, it's not always a pretty picture. Peter was not always wise. He was a remarkably flawed human being. And you see it here in this text where Jesus just completely chews him out because he doesn't understand the mission of the church. But why did Jesus choose him to be the head of the church? Is because of his passion. There's a great story in the New Testament. Most of you know it. Jesus and the disciples had been on the shoreline. Jesus had been preaching and teaching. And it gets late, and Jesus tells the disciples, the 12 disciples, "Y'all go ahead and get in the boat and go on ahead of me. I'm going to go up here to the hills and pray for a while." And he does, and night falls, and the disciples are out there in the boat. It gets dark, and the winds come up. There's a storm. And all of a sudden, they look up, and Jesus is coming out walking on the water. Peter was so passionate and so unafraid of failure that he says, "Lord, if it be your will, let me come on the water and walk with you." And he did. He tried it. He was a failure, of course. He failed. He failed over and over again. But there's no doubt in my mind that of the 12 disciples, Jesus looked at the 12 disciples and he said, "This is the one who has the passion. This is the one who is unafraid of failure. This is the one who will lead the church." Because he was clear about the fact that when the mission is right, the second ingredient is passion on the part of the believers. I want to read a passage for you out of John's Revelation. We don't do much preaching from the Revelation of John, but this is really interesting. In the 3rd chapter of the Revelation, there are letters written to a number of the different churches of the time. And when you get to the 14th verse, I'm going to put this up here. When you get to the 14th verse, there is a letter written to the church of Laodicea. It's not very well known bit of scripture here, but this is the way it reads. "And to the angel of the church in Laodicea write these words, the words of the Amen, the faithful and true witness, the origin of God's creation. I know your works. You are neither cold nor hot. I wish that you were either cold or hot, but because you are lukewarm and neither cold nor hot, I spew you out of my mouth." I substituted the King James Version there at the very last. I like that phrase. I spew you out of my mouth. The church is dying where passion is lacking. I want to tell you a story about a church that I know of. It's located in a city not very many miles from here. It's a city of over 6,000 residents. It is a city that is growing. And the members of the church have decided to die. They have decided to die. And by that I mean they have come together and they have voted to close the church. If you drive to this city, you can drive by the building of this church and you will see a for sale sign in front of it. It is a Methodist church. It is a Methodist church. The church is dying. I can't help but wonder what would have happened to that church if maybe we had planted a Project Hope there. You know, we planted 5 Project Hopes, 3 here in North Texas, 1 in East Texas, and 1 in a church in the state of Missouri. And in all of those places, the church is rising. I can't help but wonder what might have happened to that church had we somehow enabled them to build a house on the corner. Do you know that the people, our leaders in the house in the corner, are right now in conversation with people in other places, some of them in little tiny towns, telling them, you can build a house on the corner. It may seem unbelievable or daunting to you, but we'll help you learn how to build a house on the corner. I wonder what would have happened to this church if they'd had a house on the corner. I wonder what would have happened to them if somebody had gone to them and said, look, why don't you have an APA youth mission project for your youth? Lots of youth in this town. Huge high school. If somebody just said, our youth go to APA on a mission trip and they climb up on top of a roof and they nail nails into the top of a roof and they talk to the owner of the roof and they come back home and they say, you know what? I've spent 12 years in Sunday school. I didn't get the part about Jesus until now. And now I'm on fire for Jesus. Last week we were in Costa Rica. Christ Church was in Costa Rica, what we call our Vote team. They fitted almost 1,000 people with glasses, bringing sight to people who did not have sight. Earlier this year we were in Eastern Europe. In a year or two, I think we're going to take another team back to Bolivia. We're all over the world. But sometimes I believe that the greatest mission field that we are facing is the one that we're in the middle of, North Texas. A booming population, and the church in many places is dying. And I wonder what it would mean if we were to catch a new vision about what it means to serve beyond the walls of the church. If we were to hear with clarity the mission which Jesus gives us and have passion about what it means to reach these new populations that are all around us, I believe that God is calling us to do that. I absolutely believe that. I know some of you may be thinking, well, let me put it this way. I was reading an article the other day about T. Boone Pickens. Did you know he was at Southwestern Medical School the other day? They were kind of studying his brain because he just, he never quits. And I read this article about him, and he said, I woke up on my 84th birthday, and I thought, my God, my life is half over. So I've said this before, I'm 64 years old, but I got to tell you, I'm just getting started. And I think I got a lot of years in front of me, and I believe that our church is being called into a new mission field, a new way of making a difference. We're being called to be the church rising in North Texas. Let me say to you, we know the difference between the rising church and the dying church. Where the church is rising, we know what the mission is. We don't have to worry about that because Jesus told what it is. Feed my sheep. The passion is the part that we supply. Is the church rising or dying? The answer is in our hands.